The water didn't come from the sky that night. It came from them. The smell hit me first. Burnt oil and wet metal. It clung to the back of my throat before I even stepped fully inside the workshop. My boots sank half an inch into muddy water as I crossed the threshold. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. One of them buzzed like it was struggling to stay alive. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I just stood there, watching. My toolbox was tipped over. Wrenches scattered across the floor like they had tried to escape. A half-restored '67 Mustang sat crooked on the lift. The lower panels already stained dark from the rising waterline. I could hear the slow drip of something electrical shorting out in the back. Each drop echoed louder than it should have. Like the building itself was trying to tell me something. I walked deeper inside. The water moved with me. Ripples spreading across the concrete floor. Carrying bits of sawdust. Oil. Dirt. Pieces of my work. My life. I crouched near the drainage grate by the west wall. The one I had installed myself 10 years ago. It wasn't clogged. It wasn't broken. It was dry. Completely dry. Which meant only one thing. The water wasn't supposed to leave. It was supposed to stay. I straightened up slowly. My eyes moved toward the hill behind the property. Even from here. Even through the fogged glass and dim light. I could see it. Perfect green. Clean lines. The golf course. Not a single puddle. Not a single patch out of place. Their grass was dry. Mine was drowning. I reached for the old security monitor mounted near the office door. Static flickered for a second before the footage kicked in. Black and white. Timestamp blinking in the corner. 2:14 a.m. Headlights cut through the darkness. 2 trucks. HOA contractor logos on the side. I watched them back in. Watched them unload. Watched them open the drainage channel that used to run behind my workshop. And then I saw it. The moment everything changed. They redirected the flow. Not away from the golf course. Not toward the natural runoff. Straight down. Straight into my land. Into my building. Into everything I had built. I let the footage play to the end. No anger. No panic. Just silence. The kind that settles in your chest and stays there. Most people would have grabbed a phone right then. Called a lawyer. Filed a complaint. Tried to fight it the normal way. I didn't. Because this wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't an accident. This was a decision. Made over something small. Something stupid. A complaint about visual standards. A rusted truck parked outside too long. A workshop that didn't fit their picture-perfect view. That was all it took. That was the reason they flooded my life. I reached down and picked up one of my wrenches from the water. It felt heavier than it should have. Or maybe I just knew what it meant now. I set it back on the bench carefully. Exactly where it belonged. Then I looked back at the screen. At the trucks. At the water. At the proof. And for the first time that night, I smiled. Because what they didn't know was that the water they moved was never really theirs to control. I did not call anyone that morning. Not the insurance company. Not the county. Not even the HOA office that sat less than half a mile up the hill behind that perfect stretch of green. I just turned off the main breaker. One switch. One click. The hum of the building died instantly. The buzzing lights. The low vibration of machines on standby. All gone. Silence settled in like dust. I walked back outside and closed the door behind me. The sun was just starting to come up. Orange light cutting across the edge of the golf course like nothing had happened. Like my workshop was not sitting there soaked from the inside out. I leaned against my truck and pulled out my phone. Not to make a call. To check something. A notification had come in at 2:16 a.m. 2 minutes after their trucks showed up. I opened it. A system alert. Water flow variance detected. That system was not connected to anything inside the workshop. It was tied to something much bigger. Something buried. Something they never bothered to look up before they started digging around. I scrolled through the data slowly. Flow rate spike. Directional shift. Manual override detected at the upstream gate. That gate was not HOA property. It never was. They just assumed it was because it sat near their precious course. That assumption was going to cost them. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took one last look at the building. 10 years of work. Custom builds. Long nights. Every inch of that place had a story. And now it had water damage creeping into the walls. Into the wiring. Into everything. All because someone filed a complaint about a vehicle parked too long. That was it. That was the trigger. A rusted pickup that offended their sense of order. I let out a slow breath and climbed into my truck. The engine started with a steady rumble. Familiar. Reliable. Unlike the people running that neighborhood. I drove past the edge of the golf course on my way out. Early players were already out there. Clean polos. Quiet swings. Perfect lines. They had no idea what had happened a few hours earlier. No idea what had been set in motion. I slowed just enough to look at the maintenance shed near the drainage line. The same line they had tampered with. The same line that connected to a network far older than their bylaws. Far older than their board meetings and petty complaints. I knew every inch of it. Not because I had studied it recently. Because I had built part of it. Years ago. Before any of those houses were even there. Before the golf course. Before the HOA ever existed. Back when that land was just open ground and a project no one wanted to take responsibility for. Except me. I kept driving until the neighborhood disappeared in my rearview mirror. Then I made one call. Not to a lawyer. Not yet. I called a number that had not changed in over a decade. It rang twice before a familiar voice picked up. Calm. Direct. He did not ask why I was calling this early. He just said my name. And I knew he had already seen the alert too. I told him one thing. The upstream gate had been manually redirected. There was a pause on the line. Then a quiet response. That gate controls more than they think. I nodded even though he could not see me. I know. I said. That is why I am calling. Because if we let the system correct itself naturally, it will not stop at my property. Another pause. Longer this time. You are sure about this? He asked. I looked back in the direction of the golf course. Even from miles away I could picture it. Perfect grass. Perfect image. Built on top of a system they never respected. I answered without hesitation. I am sure. Then I ended the call. And for the first time since I stepped into that flooded workshop, I was not thinking about what they did to me. I was thinking about what their decision just unlocked. I did not go back to the workshop that day. Not because I did not care. But because I already knew what I would find. Water does not negotiate. It settles. It spreads. It claims everything it touches. Instead, I drove to a place most people would never notice. A low concrete structure about 3 miles downstream from the neighborhood. No sign. No gate. Just a chain-link fence and a weathered access road. I parked outside and stepped out into the dry morning air. The ground here was firm. Untouched. Exactly how it should be when a system is working the way it was designed. I walked up to the control panel mounted on the exterior wall. The paint was chipped. The lock was old. But it still recognized me. I punched in the code. The door clicked open with a soft mechanical sound that felt more familiar than anything I had heard all morning. Inside, the air was cooler. Cleaner. A low hum filled the room. Not loud. Just steady. Controlled. Screens lined the far wall. Each one displaying flow rates. Pressure levels. Directional maps of underground channels that ran beneath the entire area. Beneath my workshop. Beneath their golf course. Beneath every house they thought they owned. I stepped closer and tapped the center display. The same alert from earlier pulsed in the corner. Flow variance confirmed. Manual override upstream. System attempting correction. I let out a slow breath. Attempting was the key word. The system was designed to protect the region from flooding. But it followed rules. It respected inputs. And right now, someone had forced it into a configuration it was never meant to hold. I pulled up the original schematics. Old files. My files. Back when this was just a contract no one wanted. Too complex. Too expensive. Too easy to ignore until something went wrong. I had taken it anyway. Built redundancies. Fail-safes. Pressure release pads that could redirect excess flows safely if one section was compromised. Those paths did not point toward my workshop. They pointed somewhere else. Somewhere wide. Somewhere open. Somewhere no one ever expected to become part of the system. I zoomed in on the map. The golf course lit up in clean green lines, sitting right on top of one of the largest secondary channels. Not active under normal conditions, but fully connected. Fully capable. If triggered. I rested my hand on the console for a moment. Not hesitating. Just remembering. The meetings back then. The approvals. The signatures. I had insisted on keeping partial control over emergency routing. They agreed because they thought it would never matter. They wanted the project done. Cheap. Quiet. Invisible. And now it was about to be anything but invisible. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A new notification. Not from the system this time. From the HOA office. A formal message. Polite tone. Legal language. They had noticed the flooding at my property. They expressed concern. They mentioned possible violations related to drainage compliance. I almost laughed. They were already preparing to blame me. Already trying to frame it as my fault. I locked the phone and set it face down on the console. Then I looked back up at the map. At the flow lines. At the pressure building where it should not be. They thought they had moved water. Controlled it. Directed it like it was theirs to command. But they never understood the scale of what they touched. I reached for the control interface and entered a command sequence I had not used in years. The system responded instantly. Awaiting authorization. I placed my thumb on the scanner. A soft beep confirmed what had always been true. I still had access. Full access. Not as a resident. Not as a victim. But as the one who built the system they were now standing on. I watched the screen shift. New pathways highlighted. Pressure recalculated. Flow redirected according to original safety design. Not revenge. Not emotion. Just correction. But correction at this scale does not stay small. It moves. It spreads. It finds the lowest point and fills it. I stepped back from the console as the system began to adjust. Slow at first. Then faster. The hum in the room deepened slightly. Not loud. Just enough to feel. I looked at the map one last time. The green lines beneath the golf course flickered. Then turned a different color. Active. And in that moment, I knew something they did not. By trying to flood one building, they had just activated an entire network they could not stop. By noon, the first call came in. Not to me. To the HOA office. I know because the system logs mirrored every spike in pressure with timestamps that lined up perfectly with the outside world. At 12:07 p.m., the first anomaly hit the edge of the course. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a soft settling beneath the turf. The kind of thing only a groundskeeper would notice. A slight dip where there used to be firmness. Water finding its way upward through soil that had never been meant to carry that kind of load. I stood inside the control room and watched the numbers climb. Flow rate increasing. Containment thresholds adjusting automatically. The system was not failing. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Redirect excess safely. Away from structures that could not handle it. Toward open land that could absorb it. The problem was simple. The most open land in that entire network was now sitting directly under their golf course. At 12:19 p.m., the calls multiplied. Irrigation complaints. Equipment malfunctions. A section near the 9th hole reporting saturation levels well beyond normal limits. I could picture it clearly without even being there. Perfect green turning darker. Shoes sinking slightly where they should not. Confusion turning into concern. I leaned against the console and folded my arms. Still calm. Still quiet. Because this was only the beginning. At 12:32 p.m., the HOA board sent out an emergency notice. Temporary closure of select areas due to unexpected water behavior. They still did not understand. They thought this was a maintenance issue. A broken pipe. Something small. Something they could fix with a crew and a few hours of work. They had no idea the system they tampered with was recalibrating on a scale far beyond their control. I checked the upstream gate data again. Still locked in the position they forced. That was the key. As long as that override remained, the system would continue compensating. Continue pushing water into the only available release zone. And that zone was expanding by the minute. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a direct call. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. A woman's voice. Sharp. Controlled. Trying to sound calm but failing around the edges. She introduced herself as Laura Whitman, HOA president. I recognized the name instantly. She did not waste time. She said they were experiencing unusual ground saturation near the course. She asked if I had noticed anything irregular on my property. I almost smiled at the word. Irregular. I looked at the screen in front of me. At the growing blue overlay spreading beneath their land. Then I answered in the same calm tone I had used all morning. I told her my workshop had been flooded overnight. There was a pause on the line. Not long. But enough. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge responsibility. She shifted immediately. Asked if my drainage setup might be affecting surrounding areas. That was the moment I knew exactly who I was dealing with. No accountability. Only redirection. I kept my voice steady. I told her my system had been functioning perfectly until someone manually altered upstream flow. Silence again. Heavier this time. She knew. Or at least she suspected. But she was not ready to admit it. Instead, she said they would be sending a team to inspect. I told her that would be a good idea. Then I ended the call before she could say anything else. I placed the phone back on the console and looked up at the map again. The blue had spread further now, covering almost a third of the course footprint. Not visible on the surface yet in full. But building. Pressurizing. Waiting. The system was still stabilizing. Still redistributing. And every second that upstream gate remained forced in their favor, the correction would continue in mine. I stepped closer to the screen and zoomed out. The entire network came into view. Miles of underground channels. Reservoir points. Overflow paths. All connected. All responding. And at the center of the current shift. Their neighborhood. Their course. Their decisions. They thought they had control because they could move a gate in the dark. They thought they could push a problem downhill and never see it again. But water does not forget direction. And systems like this do not ignore imbalance. They correct it. Completely. I checked the pressure readings one more time. Then I turned off the overhead light in the control room. Let the screens glow in the dim space. Quiet. Steady. Unstoppable. Because what was happening now was no longer about a single building. It was about an entire network reclaiming balance. And they were standing right on top of it. By early afternoon, the tone shifted. What started as quiet concern turned into controlled panic. The system logs did not just show pressure anymore. They showed escalation. At 1:08 p.m., the saturation line crossed a threshold that triggered secondary alerts. Not mine. Theirs. External systems tied to irrigation controls and turf management began flagging irregular absorption rates. I watched it all unfold from the control room. Calm. Detached. Because every alert they received was something I had already seen coming hours earlier. My phone lit up again. This time it was not just one call. It was 3. Then 5. Missed calls stacking from unknown numbers. One voicemail came through before I even considered answering. I played it on speaker. It was Laura Whitman again. Her voice was different now. Less controlled. Still trying to sound composed, but the strain was obvious. She said they were experiencing structural concerns beneath parts of the course. She used careful words. Settlement. Instability. She avoided saying what it really was. Water where it should not be. I let the message end without responding. Then I looked back at the map. The blue had deepened. Not just wider. Heavier. The system had fully committed to the correction path. At 1:22 p.m., the first full section went offline. The 9th hole. Closed. Completely. Equipment pulled back. Staff redirected. I could almost hear the confusion from here. Orders being given without full understanding. People reacting to symptoms without seeing the cause. I zoomed into the data stream and pulled up the financial overlay tied to the course operations. It was an optional module I had helped integrate years ago. Back when they wanted efficiency reports. Cost tracking. Risk assessment. They never removed it. Probably forgot it was even there. But I did not. The numbers started updating in real time. Maintenance costs rising. Emergency response expenses kicking in. Lost operational revenue ticking upward by the minute. It was not dramatic yet. Not millions. Not even close. But it was climbing. And it would not stop as long as the system remained in this state. At 1:37 p.m., another call came in. I answered this one. Not because I had to. But because I wanted to hear it. A man this time. Different voice. Legal tone. He introduced himself as counsel for the HOA. He spoke carefully. Measured. He said they were aware of interconnected drainage impacts, affecting both my property and theirs. He asked if I would be willing to cooperate in resolving the issue quickly. I leaned against the console and let a few seconds pass before responding. I told him I had already reported unauthorized tampering with upstream infrastructure. I told him I had video evidence. Time-stamped. Clear. There was a pause on his end. Then a shift. He asked if I would consider sharing that evidence privately before any formal action was taken. That was when I knew they were starting to see it. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to feel the edge of it. I kept my voice steady. I said I would be happy to provide everything through proper legal channels. Nothing informal. Nothing off record. Another pause. Longer this time. He understood exactly what that meant. Costs. Exposure. Liability. The kind that does not stay contained to one incident. I ended the call without waiting for his reply. Then I turned back to the system. The flow had stabilized into a pattern now. Continuous. Relentless. The correction was no longer adjusting. It was executing. I walked over to the side panel and pulled up land ownership overlays. Old records. Updated continuously through county data feeds. Property lines. Easements. Infrastructure rights. I tapped the section beneath the golf course. Highlighted in a different color. Not theirs. Never fully theirs. Utility-controlled land. Managed under a long-term agreement that very few people ever bothered to read. I had. Every line of it. Years ago. When I signed my part of the project. When I made sure that control over critical systems did not disappear into committees and boards that only cared about appearances. My phone buzzed one more time. A text message this time. Short. Direct. From the same number that called me earlier in the morning. One line. You need to come see this. I looked back at the map. Then at the time. Then I grabbed my keys. Because the system could tell me everything. But there is a difference between numbers on a screen and standing in the middle of a consequence no one saw coming. And I wanted to see exactly how far their decision had gone. I reached the neighborhood just after 2:10 p.m. The air felt different before I even stepped out of the truck. Not humid. Not heavy. Just wrong. Like something underneath the ground was shifting in ways it was never supposed to. I parked near the edge of the course where the maintenance path met the main road. A small group had already gathered. Grounds crew. A couple of residents. Phones out. Voices low but tense. I stepped out and closed the door behind me slowly. No one noticed me at first. Their attention was locked on the fairway ahead. I followed their line of sight. The 9th hole was gone. Not destroyed. Not broken. Just sunken. The grass was still there. Green. Perfect on the surface. But the entire section had dropped several inches. Maybe more in the center. Enough that water had begun pooling in a shallow basin that had never existed before. It reflected the sky in uneven patches. Shoes left impressions that filled instantly. One of the crew members stepped forward and tested the ground with the tool. It sank deeper than expected. He pulled it back quickly and shook his head. I walked closer, slow and steady. The smell hit. Next. Wet soil. Freshly exposed earth. Not rot. Not decay. Just saturation at a level this place was never designed to handle. I crouched near the edge and pressed my fingers lightly against the turf. It gave way with almost no resistance. Beneath that thin layer of maintained perfection was a system pushing back. Water moving upward because it had nowhere else to go. Behind me, a voice called out. Sharp. Controlled. Laura Whitman. I stood up and turned. She was already walking toward me. 2 other people behind her. One of them the same lawyer I had spoken to earlier. She did not greet me. Did not ask how I was. She went straight to the point. She said this situation was escalating and needed immediate resolution. Her eyes flicked toward the sinking ground and then back to me. She asked what I had done. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I told her I had not done anything beyond restoring the system to its original configuration. That was the truth. Clean. Simple. She did not like that answer. I could see it in the way her posture tightened. She said their engineers believed this was a chain reaction triggered by abnormal input from my property. There it was again. Redirection. Blame shifting. Even now. Even standing on top of the consequence. I took a step closer to the edge and gestured toward the ground. I told her the system was compensating for a forced upstream override. I told her it was following the only safe path available. She opened her mouth to respond, but the lawyer placed a hand lightly on her arm. He stepped forward instead. His tone was quieter. More careful. He asked one question. Who has authorization over the routing controls? I met his gaze for a moment. Then I answered without hesitation. I do. Silence dropped over the group. Not dramatic. Just sudden. The kind that makes people rethink everything they thought they understood. Laura's expression shifted. Confusion first. Then disbelief. She asked what I meant. I told her exactly what I meant. I told her I was the original systems engineer for the entire drainage network under this development. I told her I retained emergency control access under the utility agreement they signed before any of these houses were built. I watched it land. Slowly. Heavier than anything else that had happened so far. The lawyer's face changed first. Recognition. Then concern. Real concern. The kind that comes when someone finally understands the scale of a mistake. Laura looked between us, trying to piece it together. Trying to find a version of reality where she still had control. But that version was already gone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Opened the system interface. Turned the screen toward them. Flow data. Authorization logs. Timestamps. Every action. Every override. Including the one their contractors made at 2:14 a.m. No room for interpretation. No room for excuses. The lawyer exhaled slowly. He did not speak right away. When he did, his voice was different. Lower. Measured. He said they needed to reverse the upstream override immediately. I nodded once. That was correct. But I did not move. Because the system was already in motion. And reversing it now would not undo what had already been set in place. I looked back at the sinking fairway. At the water slowly claiming more space with each passing minute. Then I spoke one more time. Calm. Clear. I told them correction does not stop just because you finally understand the problem. It finishes what it started. And right now, it had a lot left to balance. By Monday morning the neighborhood looked normal from the street, but the ground told a different story. The grass along the fairway sagged like a sponge. Cart paths held thin ribbons of water that reflected the sky. And every sprinkler head that should have been dry was quietly weeping. I kept my routine steady. I brewed coffee at 6. I checked the sump log at 6:15. I walked the perimeter at 7. Every number on my tablet lined up with what I expected. Flow rates were stable. Pressure zones were balanced. The bypass valves I had installed months ago were doing exactly what they were designed to do. They were not visible. They were not obvious. But they were now the only thing keeping the system from correcting itself. At 8 sharp, a maintenance cart rolled past my driveway. The driver slowed down and stared at the puddle near my curb. He shook his head and kept going. By 9, a small crew was out on the course with probes and flags. They pressed rods into the soil and pulled them out dripping. One of them called someone and pointed toward the low area near hole 7. That was where the subsurface drain tied into the main trunk line. That was also where the HOA had approved a shortcut connection last spring to save on a contractor bid. I had the meeting minutes saved. I had the signatures. I had the exact language that waived a proper survey. At 10, a white SUV pulled up in front of my house. Karen stepped out in sunglasses and a crisp blazer. She did not wave this time. She walked straight to my door and knocked twice, sharp and controlled. I opened it with a neutral expression. She asked if I had noticed any unusual water activity. I said I had noticed my workshop flooding after their crew rerouted drainage without notice. I said I had documented everything. She said the course was experiencing an unexpected saturation event. I said water follows the path of least resistance. She said this was not the time for attitude. I said I agreed, which is why I had filed a formal complaint with the county last week. Her expression changed just a fraction. She asked what complaint. I told her it was about unpermitted modifications to a shared drainage system and potential impact on neighboring properties. I told her I had attached photos, timestamps, and a copy of the HOA approval. I watched her process that. She asked if I was threatening the association. I said I was documenting a problem. She asked if I had touched any of the course infrastructure. I said I had only protected my property using legal connections on my side of the line. That was true. She did not ask the next question out loud, but it hung between us. If my side was protected, where was the water going? At 11, the superintendent arrived. He spoke with the crew. He paced the wettest sections. He looked at the irrigation control box and then at his phone. He made a call that lasted 10 minutes. When he hung up, his shoulders dropped. He knew this was not a broken head or a stuck valve. This was systemic. At noon, the clubhouse sent out an email about temporary course closure due to ground conditions. By 1, the parking lot had half a dozen cars with worried owners standing in clusters. By 2, a truck from a local contractor arrived with pumps and hoses. They set up near the worst area and started moving water from one low spot to another. It did not change the overall level. It only shifted the sheen. At 3, the first rumor reached my driveway. Someone said the course could be closed for weeks. Someone else said assessments might be required to fix subsurface drainage. Numbers floated in the air. 10,000. 20,000. per household. I sat on my porch and watched the light change across the fairway. I checked my tablet again. Everything remained within the ranges I had set. The bypass valves held their positions. The pressure differential across the trunk line stayed just enough to keep water moving away from my property and into the network the HOA controlled. At 4, Karen returned, this time with the superintendent. They stood at the edge of my lawn and looked out at the course. He introduced himself and asked if he could ask a few technical questions. I nodded. He asked about elevations, about historical runoff patterns, about any private drains I might have installed. I answered calmly and precisely. I gave him numbers in feet and inches. I described slopes and soil types. I did not mention the small detail that mattered most. He thanked me. Karen did not. She said the association would be reviewing all homeowner modifications. I said I welcomed that. I said transparency would help everyone. At 5, the pumps were still running. At 6, the sun dipped low and the water caught gold along the fairway. It looked almost beautiful. It also looked expensive. And as I stood there, with my dry workshop behind me and the course slowly turning into something it was never meant to be, I knew the smallest decision they had rushed through months ago was now unfolding into something they could not easily contain. The next morning started with a different kind of silence. Not calm. Not peaceful. Controlled. Like the neighborhood was holding its breath. At 6:30, an official notice hit every inbox. Emergency HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance. Topic listed as infrastructure failure and financial exposure. I did not rush. I followed the same routine. Coffee. Logs. Perimeter walk. The numbers had shifted overnight. Not dramatically. But enough. The saturation line had expanded by another 20 feet along the 7th fairway. The pumps had been running all night. They made noise. They created movement. But they did not solve the imbalance. At 8:45, I walked into the clubhouse. The room was already full. Homeowners lined the walls. Some sat. Most stood. Voices overlapped in tight circles. Concern had turned into calculation. I saw printed estimates in people's hands. Repair projections. Legal summaries. Insurance disclaimers. Karen stood near the front with the board members. Her posture was still upright, but the confidence had cracks now. The superintendent stood off to the side with a laptop open. The lawyer from yesterday was there as well. This time he looked like he had not slept. The meeting started at 9 sharp. No small talk. No pleasantries. The lawyer spoke first. He explained that the drainage failure was not classified as a natural event. It was categorized as a man-made system imbalance triggered by unauthorized modification. The room reacted immediately. Questions. Raised voices. Someone asked who authorized it. Someone else asked what it would cost. The lawyer did not answer right away. He laid out the sequence. The shortcut connection approved by the board. The bypassing of a required survey. The contractor override executed without full system clearance. Then he paused. He said the system had responded exactly as designed. It redistributed load. It protected upstream nodes. It shifted excess flow into available capacity. He did not say my name yet. He did not need to. Karen stepped forward then. She tried to regain control. She said the board had acted in good faith. She said they relied on expert recommendations. She said unforeseen variables had created a cascading effect. The word cascading hung in the air. It sounded technical. It also sounded expensive. A homeowner near the front asked for a number. The superintendent answered this time. He said preliminary stabilization alone could exceed $2 million. Full remediation could push beyond $5 million depending on subsurface damage. The room went quiet in a different way. Not shocked. Focused. People started doing math. Dividing totals by households. Considering loans. Considering selling. Considering blame. Then the lawyer spoke again. He said liability might not be evenly distributed. He said documentation indicated specific decisions tied to specific approvals. He looked directly at the board. At Karen. And then he said one more thing. He said there was also an external control factor that limited their ability to correct the system immediately. That was when eyes started to turn. Not randomly. Toward me. I stayed where I was. Hands relaxed. Expression neutral. Karen followed their gaze. She saw me. For a second, something close to realization crossed her face. Not acceptance, but the first step toward it. She asked the lawyer what he meant by external control. He did not hedge. He said the upstream routing authority was held by a private party under a pre-existing utility agreement. He said that authority had not been transferred to the HOA. He said any attempt to override it again could increase damage and legal exposure. The room shifted. The balance of power moved without anyone touching anything. Karen took a step toward me. Not aggressive. Not confident. Careful. She asked if I would cooperate to restore the system. Every word was measured now. I looked at her for a moment. Then I answered. I said cooperation requires alignment. I said alignment requires acknowledgement. I said acknowledgement starts with responsibility. No one interrupted. No one laughed. No one argued. The lawyer nodded slightly. He understood the language. Numbers. Authority. Process. Karen inhaled slowly. She said the board was prepared to review its actions. She did not say apologize. Not yet. But the structure was changing. I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the front table. Printed logs. Timestamps. Original plans. The agreement they had. Signed years ago. Clean. Organized. Undeniable. I told them the system could be stabilized in phases. I told them it would require reversing the unauthorized connection, regrading key sections, installing proper relief lines, and most importantly, restoring control protocols. The superintendent leaned forward. He asked how long? I said stabilization could begin within 48 hours after alignment. Full recovery would take months. The number was not the most important part. The control was. And in that room, with millions of dollars on the table and a system they could not command, everyone finally understood that the smallest shortcut they had approved had led them here. And the only path forward ran directly through me. The first agreement did not happen in that room. It happened in the quiet after it. Papers gathered. Voices lowered. People left in small groups, each carrying a different version of the same realization. Control had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. By noon, my phone rang for the first time that day. It was the lawyer. His tone was steady. He said the board was prepared to enter a formal alignment process. He asked for a meeting at my place. I gave him a time. 1 o'clock. At 12:55, 2 cars pulled into my driveway. The lawyer stepped out first. Karen followed. No sunglasses this time. No sharp edges in her posture. Just focus. We sat at the table in my workshop. Dry. Clean. Exactly how it had been designed to remain. I placed the documents between us. Not as leverage. As structure. I outlined the phases again. Immediate stabilization. Controlled reversal of the unauthorized connection. Installation of compliant relief lines. Restoration of routing authority protocols under the original agreement. The lawyer took notes. Karen listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Just necessary. She spoke first. She said the board acknowledged its role in the decision that led here. She said they accepted responsibility for the modification. The words were simple. They were also the hinge everything turned on. I nodded once. That was the alignment I had been waiting for. The lawyer slid a draft across the table. Temporary control acknowledgement. Access confirmation. Liability framework. It was thorough. It was also urgent. I read it line by line. Made a few adjustments. Clarified authority boundaries. Defined response triggers. Added a clause about documentation transparency for all future changes. He accepted every revision without argument. At 1:40 we signed. Not ceremonially. Not for show. Just 3 signatures on paper that shifted the system back into a state it could recover from. At 2, I opened the interface on my tablet. I entered the authorization code. The system responded immediately. Valves adjusted in sequence. Not all at once. In measured steps. Pressure gradients recalculated. Flow paths reopened where they had been blocked. The bypass on my side eased down incrementally. Not removed. Just reduced. Enough to begin sharing load without risking my property. Outside, nothing looked dramatic. No sudden change. No visible event. But under the ground, the direction of movement had changed. Water that had been trapped began to find proper channels. The pooling on the fairway stopped expanding. The pumps kept running, but now they were assisting instead of fighting the system. At 3, the superintendent called. His voice carried something new. Relief. He said the probes were reading stabilization along the 7th and 9th holes. He said the rate of saturation had flattened. I told him to keep monitoring and not rush any adjustments. He agreed. At 4, a second email went out to the community. It was shorter than the first. It stated that a coordinated recovery plan was in place. It mentioned professional oversight. It did not mention my name. It did not need to. By 5, the light returned to the course in a different way. The sheen of water was still there, but it no longer spread. It held. It receded in places where the ground could finally breathe. I stood at the edge of my yard and watched the line where my property met theirs. It was clean. Defined. Functioning. Exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Over the next week, crews worked in sections. They removed the shortcut connection. They regraded slopes by inches that now mattered. They installed relief lines with proper permits and proper oversight. Costs came in. Numbers were confirmed. They were high. Millions. Assessments were issued. Payments scheduled. There were meetings. There were hard conversations. But there was also a clear path forward. And it held. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Karen walked up to the edge of my driveway. She did not cross it. She thanked me. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just directly. I acknowledged it with a nod. Nothing more was needed. Because the lesson had already settled into the ground beneath all of us. A small decision made for convenience can scale into something no one can control. And when it does, the real power does not come from who speaks the loudest. It comes from who understands the system. And who never needed to raise their voice to begin with.